17th. The emperor asked me some questions today relative to the officers of his household, with the exception of two or three at the most who had drawn upon themselves a contempt of the very party to which they had gone over. Nothing could be said against them. The majority had even evinced an ardent devotion to the emperor's interests. The emperor then made inquiries respecting some of these individuals in particular, calling them by their names, and I could not but express my approbation of them all. "What do you tell me?" said he, interrupting me hastily when I was speaking of one of them. "And yet I gave him so bad a reception at the Tuileries on my return? I fear I have committed some involuntary acts of injustice. This comes of being obliged to take for granted the first story that is told, and of not having a single moment to spare for verification. I fear, too, that I have left many debts of gratitude in arrear. How unfortunate it is to be incapable of doing everything oneself." I replied, "Sire, it is true that if blame be attached to the officers of your household, it must be shared equally by all. A fact, however, which must humble us strangely in the eyes of foreign nations. As soon as the king appeared, all hastened to him, not as to the sovereign whom your abdication had left us, but as to one who had never ceased to be our sovereign, not with the dignity of men proud of having always fulfilled their duties, but with the equivocal embarrassment of unskilled courtiers. Each individual sought only to justify himself. Your Majesty was from that instant disavowed and abjured. The title of emperor was dropped. The ministers, nobles, the intimate friends of your Majesty styled you simply Buonaparte, and blushed not for themselves or for their nation. They excused themselves by saying that they had been compelled to serve, that they could not do otherwise, though dread of the treatment might have experienced. The emperor here recognized a true picture of our national character. He said we were still the same people as our ancestors, the Gauls, that we still retain the same levity, the same constancy, and above all, the same vanity. When shall we, said he, exchange this vanity for a little pride? Officers of your Majesty's household, said I, neglected a noble opportunity of acquiring both honor and popularity. There were above 150 officers of the household. A great number of them belonged to the first families and were men of independent fortune. It was for them to set an example, which, being followed by others, might have given another impulse to the national attitude and afforded us a claim on public esteem. Yes, said the emperor, if all the upper classes had acted in that way, affairs might have turned out very differently. The old editors of the public journals would not then have indulged in their chimeras of the good old times. We should not then have been annoyed with the dissertations on the straight line and the curved line. The king would have adhered honestly to his charter. I should never have dreamed of quitting the island of Elba. The head of the nation would have been recorded in history with greater honor and dignity, and we should have all been the gainers. The 18th. After the accustomed occupation of the day, I accompanied the emperor to the garden about 4 o'clock. He had just completed his dictation on the subject of Corsica. Having concluded everything he had to say relative to that island and to Paoli, he adverted to the interest which he himself excited there. While yet so young at the time of his separation from Paoli, he added that latterly he might to a certainty have united in his favor the wishes, the sentiments, and the efforts of the whole population of Corsica, and that he had retired to that island on quitting Paris, he would have been beyond the reach of any foreign power whatever. He had an idea of doing so, and he abdicated in favor of his son. He was on the point of reserving to himself the possession of Corsica during his life. No obstacle at sea would have obstructed his passage thither. But he abandoned that design for the sake of rendering his abdication the more sincere and the more advantageous to France. His residence in the center of the Mediterranean, in the bosom of Europe, so near France and Italy, might have furnished a lasting pretext to the Allies. He even preferred America to England from the same motive and the same idea. It is true that in the sincerity of his own measures he neither did nor could foresee his unjust and violent banishment to St. Helena, the emperor next proceeding to take a review of different points of the revolution dwelt particularly on Robespierre, whom he did not know, but whom he believed to be destitute of talent, energy, or system. He considered him, notwithstanding, merely as the scapegoat of the revolution sacrificed as soon as he endeavored to arrest it in its course. The common fate, he observed, of all who before himself, Napoleon, had ventured to take that step. The terrorists and their doctrines survived Robespierre, and if their excesses were not continued, it was because they were obliged to bow to public opinion. They threw all the blame on Robespierre, but the latter declared shortly before his death that he was a stranger to the recent executions and that he had not appeared in the committees for 6 weeks previously. Napoleon confessed that while he was with the army of Nice, he had seen some long letters addressed by Robespierre to his brother, condemning the horrors of the commissioners of the convention, who, as he expressed it, were ruining the revolution by their tyranny and atrocities. Cambacérès, who observed the emperor must be a good authority on subjects relating to that period, answered an inquiry which I one day addressed to him respecting the condemnation of Robespierre in these remarkable words: "Sire, that was a sentence without a trial," adding that Robespierre had more foresight and conception than was generally imagined, that his intention was, after subduing the unbridled factions which he had to oppose, to restore a system of order and moderation some time previous to his fall, added Cambacérès. He delivered a most admirable speech on this subject. It was not thought proper to insert it in the Moniteur, and all trace of it is now lost. This is not the first instance I have heard of omissions and want of accuracy in the Moniteur and the reports inserted in that journal relative to the proceedings of the Assembly. There must be a period remarkable for incorrectness, as the minutes of those proceedings were for a time arbitrarily drawn up by one of the committees. Those who are induced to believe that Robespierre was at once wearied, satiated, and alarmed by the revolution, and had resolved on checking it, affirm that he would not take any decided step until after he had read his famous speech. He considered it so fine that he had no doubt of its effect on the Assembly. If this be true, his mistake, his vanity cost him dear. Those who think differently assert that Danton and Camille Desmoulins had precisely the same views, and yet that Robespierre sacrificed them. To these it is replied that Robespierre sacrificed them to preserve his popularity because he judged that the decisive moment had not yet arrived, or because he did not wish to resign to them the glory of the enterprise. Be this as it may, it is certain that nearer we approach to the instruments and the agents in that catastrophe, the greater obscurity and mystery we find, and this uncertainty will but increase with time. Thus the page of history will, on this point, as on many others, become the record, not so much of the events which really occurred, as of the statements which are given of them. In the course of our conversation relative to Robespierre, the emperor said that he had been very well acquainted with his brother, the younger Robespierre, the representative to the army of Italy. He said nothing against this young man, whom he had led into action, inspired with great confidence and considerable enthusiasm for his person, so much so that previously to the night of Thermidor, young Robespierre, being recalled by his brother, who was then secretly laying his plans, insisted on Napoleon's accompanying him to Paris. The latter experienced the greatest difficulty in ridding himself of the importunity, and at length only escaped it by requesting the interference of the General-in-Chief de Mourbillon, whose entire confidence he possessed, and who represented that it was absolutely necessary he should remain where he was. Had I followed young Robespierre, said the emperor, how different might have been my career! On what trivial circumstances does human fate depend? Some office would doubtless have been assigned to me, and I might at that moment have been destined to attempt a sort of Vendemiaire. But I was then very young. My ideas were not yet fixed. It is probable, indeed, that I should not have undertaken any task that might have been allotted to me. But supposing the contrary case, and even admitting that I had been successful, what results could I have hoped for? In Vendemiaire, the revolutionary fever was totally subdued. In Thermidor, it was still raging in its utmost fury, and at its greatest height. Public opinion, said the emperor on another occasion when conversing on another subject, is an invisible and mysterious power which it is impossible to resist. Nothing is more unsteady, more vague, or more powerful. And, capricious as it may be, it is nevertheless just and reasonable more frequently than it is supposed. On becoming provisional consul, the first act of my administration was the banishment of 50 anarchists. Public opinion, which had at first been furiously hostile to them, suddenly turned in their favor, and I was forced to retract. But some time afterwards, these same anarchists, having shown a disposition to engage in plots, were again overthrown by that very public opinion which had now returned to support me. Thus, through the errors that were committed at the time of the Restoration, popularity was secured to the regicides, who but a moment before had been proscribed by the great mass of the nation. It belonged to me only, continued the emperor, to shed a luster over the memory of Louis XVI in France, and to purify the nation of the crimes with which it had been sullied by frantic acts and unfortunate fatalities. The Bourbons, being of the royal family and coming from abroad, merely avenged their own private cause and augmented the national opprobrium. I, on the contrary, being one of the people, should have raised the character of the nation by banishing from society in her name those whose crimes had disgraced her. This was my intention, but I proceeded prudently in the fulfillment of it. The 3 expiatory altars at Saint-Denis were but a prelude to my design. The Temple of Glory on the site of the Madeleine was to have been devoted to this object with still greater solemnity. There near the tomb and over the very bones of the political victims of our revolution, monuments and religious ceremonies would have consecrated their memory in the name of the French people. This is a secret that was not known to above 10 individuals, though it had been found necessary to communicate a hint of the design to those who were entrusted with the arrangement of the edifice. I should not have executed my scheme in less than 10 years, but what precautions had I not adopted? How carefully had I smoothed every difficulty and removed every obstruction? All would have applauded my design, and no one would have suffered from it. So much depends on circumstances and forms, added he, that in my reign Carnot would not have dared to write a memorial boasting of the death of the king, though he did so under the Bourbons. I should have leagued with public opinion in punishing him, while public opinion sided with him in rendering him unassailable. The 19th. My son and I rose very early. Our task had been finished on the preceding day, and as the emperor could not want me for some time, we availed ourselves of the fineness of the morning to explore the neighborhood of our abode, passing through the valley of Jamestown. On the right of our little level height at Friars was a deep ravine, the sides of which were intersected by numerous perpendicular clefts. We descended into the ravine, not without difficulty, and found ourselves at the edge of a little limpid streamlet, beside which grew abundance of cresses. We amused ourselves by gathering them as we passed along, and after a few windings, we soon reached the extremity of the valley and the streamlet, which are closed transversely by a huge pointed mass of rock, from the summit of which issues a pretty cascade produced from the waters of the surrounding heights. This waterfall, descending into the valley, forms the streamlet along which we had just passed, and which sometimes rolls in a torrent to the sea. The water of the cascade was at this moment dispersed above our heads in small rain or light vapor, but in stormy weather it rushes forth in a torrent and furiously dashes through the ravine till it reaches the sea. Thus the scene presented a gloomy, solitary, and melancholy aspect, and it was altogether so interesting that we quitted it with regret. Today was Sunday, and we all dined with the emperor. He good-humoredly observed that we composed his state party. After dinner, the circle of our amusements was not very extensive. He asked us whether we would have a comedy, an opera, or a tragedy. We decided in favor of a comedy, and he himself read a portion of Molière's Avare, which was continued by other individuals of the party. The emperor had a cold and was slightly feverish. He withdrew early from his walk in the garden and desired me to see him again that evening. If he should not have gone to bed, my son and I accompanied the rest of the gentlemen to the town, and on our return the emperor had retired to rest. the 20th. The emperor, after dictating as usual with one of his gentlemen, called me about 5 o'clock. He was alone, the rest of the gentlemen and my son having gone to the town where the admiral was that evening to give a ball. The emperor and I walked along the road leading to the town until we came within sight of the sea and the shipping. On the left, in the depth of the valley, was a pretty little house. The emperor stood for a considerable time with his glass at his eye, examining the garden, which appeared to be very well cultivated, and in which a group of beautiful children were at play, attended by their mother. We were informed that this house belonged to Major Hudson, a resident of the island, the same gentleman who had lent me the annual register. The house was situated at the bottom of the ravine, which commences in the vicinity of Briars and near the curious cascade, which I have already noticed. The emperor took a fancy to go down to the house, though it was now nearly 6 o'clock. The road was extremely steep. We found it longer and more difficult of descent than we had expected, and we reached the bottom of the ravine quite out of breath. We took a survey of the little domain, which had evidently been laid out as the residence of a permanent occupant and not as the mere temporary abode of a traveler passing to a foreign land. And after receiving the attentions of the master of the house and paying a few compliments to the mistress, the emperor took his leave. But the evening was already far advanced, and we were very much fatigued. We therefore accepted the horses that were offered us and speedily returned to our hut and our dinner. This little excursion and the exercise of riding on horseback, which had been so long relinquished, seemed to do the emperor good. He desired that I would go to the admiral's ball in spite of my reluctance to leave him. At 8:30 o'clock, he observed that the night was dark, the road bad, and that it was time I had set out. He insisted on my leaving him, and he entered his room, where I saw him undressed and retired to bed. He again desired me to go, and I unwillingly obeyed. I left him alone, and thus for the first time violated a custom which had become most dear to me. I proceeded on foot to the town. The admiral had given a great eclat to his ball. It had been talked of for a considerable time before. He wished it to be understood that the entertainment was given solely on our account, and we had been formally invited. Was it most advisable to accept or decline the invitation? Something might be said on both sides. Political misfortunes did not require that we should assume the appearance of domestic sorrow. It might be proper and even useful to mingle cheerfully in company with our jailers. We might therefore adopt either resolution. Indifferently, we determined to go. But what sort of conduct were we to observe? Should we assume pride or employ address? The first might be attended with inconvenience. In our situation, every wounded pretension became an insult. And the second, there could be no impropriety to receive marks of politeness as though we were accustomed to them, and as though they were due, and to overlook any little want of respect was certainly the wisest course. I arrived at the ball very late and left it very early. I was much pleased with the entertainment in every respect. The 21st through the 22nd, the emperor, who had often questioned me on the line of conduct pursued by many of his ministers, members of his council, and officers of his household during his residence at the island of Elba, at length called me to account in my turn, saying, "But you yourself, Las what did you do after the arrival of the king? What happened to you all at that time? Come, sir, make a report on that subject. You know this is my way, and it is the only plan by which we can properly classify what we say or what we wish to learn. Besides, it will furnish you with another article for your journal. And don't you see," added he, jokingly, "your biographers will only have the trouble of extracting. The thing will be already written in their hands." "Sire," I replied, "you shall have a literal statement of everything, though I have but little to say. I commanded on the 31st of March the 10th Legion of the National Guard of Paris. That of the legislative body we lost during the day a considerable number of men. At night I heard the capitulation. I wrote to the officer next in rank to myself and transferred to him the command of my legion, informing him that though in my quality of member of the Council of State, I had previously received orders to proceed elsewhere, yet I had not wished to abandon my legion at the moment of danger, but that in the event which had just occurred, having changed the aspect of affairs, I must now proceed forthwith to fulfill new duties. At daybreak, I set out on the road to Fontainebleau and found myself in the midst of the wrecks of Marmont and Martier's detachments. I was on foot, and I doubted not I should be able to purchase a horse. I soon, however, discovered that soldiers in retreat are neither just nor civil. After that, disastrous moment, my uniform of a National Guard was insulted, and I was myself ill-treated. After an hour's walk, overpowered by the fatigue of the journey, joined to the want of rest, which I had experienced for 2 or 3 nights previously, seeing around me no face that I knew, and having no hope of procuring a horse, I determined with a sorrowful heart to return to the capital. The National Guard was ordered out to assist in the triumphant the entry of the enemy. There was even a probability of its being selected as a guard of honor to the sovereigns who had conquered us. I determined to be absent from my home. I had conveyed my wife and children safely out of Paris a week or 2 before, and for a few days had recourse to the hospitality of a friend. I never went out of doors but in a shabby greatcoat, visiting the coffee houses and public places and joining the different groups which were formed in the streets. My object was to make observations on persons and things, and above all, to learn the real feeling of the people. How many extraordinary occurrences did I not witness in the course of my rambles? I saw in front of the residence of the Emperor of Russia men distinguished by their rank and calling themselves Frenchmen, exerting their utmost endeavors to induce the rabble to call out, "Long live Alexander, our deliverer!" I saw, sir, your monument on the Place Vendôme resist the efforts of a few wretches belonging to the lowest ranks of the people who had been hired by persons of note. Finally, in one of the corners of the Place Vendôme, before the hotel of the commandant of the place, I saw one of the officers of your household trying on the first evening after your departure to prevail on young conscripts to enter another service than yours. But he received from them a lesson that might have made him blush for his own conduct. Had he been capable of feeling shame, doubtless those to whom I here allude will exclaim that I mingled with the rabble, and yet it may be with justice affirmed that the acts of baseness which then disgraced France did not originate with the rabble. These acts were far from obtaining the countenance of the lower classes of the people. On the contrary, they were decidedly censured by the uprightness, generosity, and nobleness of sentiment manifested in the public streets. What reproaches might I not convey were I to repeat all that I heard on this subject? Your Majesty abdicated. I refused my signature to the act of adherence to the Council of State, but I thought I might make amends for this by an additional act of adherence. The Moniteur was every day filled with articles of this kind. Mine, however, was not deemed worthy of the honor of insertion. At length the king arrived. He was henceforth our sovereign. He appointed a day for the reception of those individuals who had been presented to Louis XVI. I proceeded to the Tuileries to avail myself of this prerogative. What were my reflections on entering those apartments, which had so lately been filled with your glory and power? And yet I presented myself to the king sincerely and in good faith. My foresight never led me even to think of your return. Deputations to the king were multiplied beyond number. A meeting of the officers of the naval establishments was proposed. To the person who communicated this fact to me, I replied that nothing could be more gratifying to my heart than to join my old comrades, none of whom could entertain sentiments purer than I did, but that the offices I had filled placed me in a peculiar and delicate situation, and that motives of prudence must deter me from appearing where the zeal of a president might lead him to employ expressions which I neither could nor would sanction by my opinion or presence. Subsequently, however, in spite of my mortification and disgust, I determined, at the solicitation of some friends, to think of something for myself. The Council of State was recomposed. Several members of the last council assured me, in spite of my recent conjectures on that point, that nothing was easier than to retain my office, that they had succeeded merely by an application to the Chancellor of France. I had not courage to venture a moment's encroachment on his lordship's time, and therefore contented myself with writing to acquaint him that I had been master of requests to the last Council of State, and that if that circumstance were not sufficient to exclude me from becoming a member of the new assembly, I begged him to recommend me to the king as a Councillor of State. I observed that I would not advance as claims to favor my 11 years of emigration or the loss of my patrimony in the king's cause. At that period I had only done what I then considered to be my duty, which I had at all times, to the best of my knowledge, fulfilled faithfully and to the last moment. This phrase, as may well be supposed, deprived me even of the honor of a reply. Meanwhile, the new situation in Paris, the sight of the foreign troops, the acclamations of every kind were more than I could endure. And I adopted the determination of going for a short time to London, where I could meet with old friends who might afford me all the consolation of which I was susceptible. And again, I recollected that I might find in London the same tumult and the same exultation that had driven me from Paris, as proved to be the fact. London was the scene of festivity and rejoicing, to celebrate the triumphs of the English and our humiliation. During my stay in London, the maritime establishment was remodeled at Paris, and the Chevalier de Grimaldi, one of my old comrades whom I had not seen or heard of for a long time, was appointed a member of the committee. He called on my wife and expressed his surprise that I had not put in my claims, observing that I was entitled by law to return to the court or to retire on a certain pension. He advised my wife to bring me to a decision on the subject and to rely on his friendship, adding that there was no time to be lost. I attached higher value to this mark of attention than to the favor which it was intended to procure me. However, I wrote to the committee requesting that, as I was desirous of wearing a uniform to which I had become attached, I might be allowed to enjoy the honorary title of Capitaine de Vaisseau, while at the same time I renounced the pension to which I did not conceive myself entitled. I returned to Paris. The diversity of opinions and the irritation of the public mind were extreme. I had for a long time lived in the greatest retirement. I now confined myself entirely to the domestic circle of my wife and children. Never at any former period of my life did I prove myself a better husband or a better father, and never perhaps was I more physically happy, as I was one day reading in the Journal des Débats an account of a work of Monsieur Beauchamp. I found mentioned the names of several gentlemen who were stated to have assembled on the Place Louis XV on the 31st of March to excite sentiments in favor of royalty, and my name was among the number. It was in good company, no doubt, but at the same time, the statement was untrue, and I should have been considerably lowered in the estimation of many if it had been believed. I wrote to request a correction of the error, which was calculated to render me the subject of congratulations to which I was in no way entitled. I observed that it was out of my power at the time to act in the way described, whatever might have been my inclination. As the commander of a legion of the National Guard, I had contracted obligations from which no consideration on earth could free me, etc. I sent my letter to the deputy Chaveau-Latour, one of the proprietors of the Journal de Débat, a man for whom I entertained a great esteem. He declined publishing my letter, purely from good intentions towards me. I then addressed it to the editor, but he refused to insert it on account of difference of opinion. Meanwhile, the state of the public mind indicated an inevitable and speedy catastrophe. Everything foreboded that the Bourbons would share the fate of the Stuarts. My wife and I used every evening to amuse ourselves in reading Hume's History of England. We began at Charles I, and Your Majesty arrived before we had got to James II. Here the Emperor could not repress a laugh. Your Majesty's advance and arrival, continued I, were to us a subject of the greatest astonishment and anxiety. I was far from foreseeing the honorable voluntary exile which I would gain for me in the end, for I was then little known to Your Majesty, and circumstances arising out of that event alone brought me here. Had I filled the most trivial post under the king, had I even been a frequent attendant at the Tuileries, which would have been very natural and consistent with propriety, I should not have appeared for a length of time in Your Majesty's presence, not indeed that I should have had anything to reproach myself with, or that my attachment to you would have been the less sincere, but because I should not have wished to pass for a piece of court furniture, or to seem always ready to offer incense at the shrine of power. I should have awaited an appointment instead of pressing forward to solicit one, but as it were, I felt myself so much at liberty, everything about me was in such perfect harmony, that I seemed to form a part of the great event. I therefore eagerly hastened to meet the first glance of Your Majesty. I felt as though I had claims on your kindness and favor. On your return from Waterloo, the same sentiments brought me immediately and spontaneously near your person, which I have never since quitted. If I was then attracted by your public glory, I am now attached by your private virtues. And if it be true that the gratification of my feelings then cost me some sacrifice, I now find myself repaid 100-fold by the happiness I enjoy in being able to tell you so. It would, however, be difficult to describe the extreme disgust I felt at everything during the 10 months of your absence. I felt an utter contempt for mankind and worldly vanities. Every illusion was destroyed. All interest had vanished. Everything appeared to be at an end, or to be undeserving of the smallest value. During my emigration, I had received the Cross of St. Louis, and ordinance decreed that it was to be legitimated by a new brevet. I had not spirit to put in my chain. Another ordinance directed that the titles bestowed by your majesty should be set in and confirmed, but I felt indifferent with regard to compromising those which I had obtained during the empire. In fine, I received a letter from the Marine Department informing me that my captain's commission had just been forwarded thither, and there it still remains. Your Majesty's absence was to me a widowhood, the affliction and grief of which I concealed from no one, but on your return I was repaid for all by the testimony borne by those who surrounded you and to whom I had previously been scarcely known. At your Majesty's first levee, the individual who was ad interim at the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, coming from the presence, took me aside to a window and told me to go home and prepare, as I should probably have to set out on a journey. He had just, he said, proposed me to your Majesty, adding that he had represented me as a madman, but mad for love of you. I wished to know whither I was to be sent, but that he said he neither would nor could tell me. I never heard anything more of the matter. Monsieur Regnault de Saint-Jean d'Angely placed me on the list of the imperial commissioners whom your Majesty sent to the departments. I assured him that I was ready to do anything, but I observed that I was a noble and an emigrant, and that these two words pronounced by the first comer would be sufficient to annihilate me in case of necessity at any time or in any place. He acknowledged the justice of my observation and relinquished his intention. A senator next solicited that your Majesty would appoint me to the prefecture of Metz, his native town. He requested me to make this sacrifice for only 3 months in order, as he said, to conciliate the popular mind and set things to rights. At length, Decret and the Duc de Bassano proposed me as a councillor of state on the 3rd day after your arrival. Your Majesty signed my appointment the 23rd. The Emperor was still indisposed. He confined himself to his room and would see nobody. He sent for me at 9 o'clock in the evening. I found him very low-spirited and melancholy. He scarcely spoke to me, and I did not dare to say anything to him. If I regarded his illness as merely physical, it grieved me sincerely. If he labored under mental affliction, how much more was I grieved that I could not employ all the resources of consolation with which the heart naturally overflows for those whom we truly love. The Emperor dismissed me in about half an hour, the 24th. The Emperor continued indisposed and still declined seeing anybody. He sent for me to dine with him at a late hour. Dinner was served on a little table beside the sofa on which he was lying. He ate heartily. He said that he stood in need of some sudden revulsion of the constitution, which he should soon obtain. So well did he understand his own temperament. After dinner, he took up the Memoirs of Marshal de Villars, which amused him. He read aloud many passages, which revived former recollections and gave rise to many anecdotes. The 25th, the Emperor still continued unwell. He had passed a bad night. At his desire, I dined with him beside the sofa, which he was unable to leave. He was, however, evidently much better. After dinner, he wished to read. He had a heap of books scattered round him on the sofa. The rapidity of his imagination, the fatigue of dwelling always on the same subject, or of reading what he already knew, caused him to take up and throw down the books one after the other. At length he fixed on Racine's Iphigenia and amused himself by pointing out the beauties and discussing the few faults to be found in that work. He dismissed me at an early hour, contrary to the general opinion in which I myself once participated. The Emperor is far from possessing a strong constitution. His limbs are large, but his fibers are relaxed with a very expanded chest. He is constantly laboring under the effects of cold. His body is subject to the influences of the slightest accidents. The smell of paint is sufficient to make him ill. Certain dishes or the slightest degree of damp immediately take a severe effect on him. His body is far from being a body of iron, as is generally supposed. All his strength is in his mind. His prodigious exertions abroad and his incessant labors at home are known to everyone. No sovereign ever underwent so much bodily fatigue. The most remarkable instance of the emperor's activity and exertion was his riding posts from Valladolid to Burgos, a distance of 35 Spanish leagues, in 5 hours and a half. That is to say, upwards of 7 leagues an hour. The emperor had set out accompanied by a numerous escort in case of danger from the guerrillas, but at every yard he left some of his company behind him, and he arrived at Burgos with but few followers. His ride from Vienna to the Simmering, a distance of 18 or 20 leagues, is also frequently talked of. The emperor rode to breakfast at the Simmering and returned to Vienna immediately after. Napoleon often hunted to the distance of 38 leagues and never less than 15. One day a Russian officer would come as a courier from St. Petersburg on the space of 12 or 13 days, arrived at Fontainebleau at the moment when the emperor was about to set out on a hunt. By way of arrest, the officer had the honor to be invited to join the hunting party. He, of course, accepted the invitation, but he dropped down in the forest, overcome by fatigue, and was not found until after considerable search had been made for him. I have known the emperor to be engaged in business at the council of state for 8 or 9 hours successively, and afterwards rise with his ideas as clear as when he sat down. I have seen him at St. Helena peruse books for 10 or 12 hours in succession on the most abstruse subjects without appearing in the least fatigued. He has suffered unmoved the greatest shocks that ever man experienced. On his return from Moscow or Leipzig, after he had communicated the disastrous event in the council of state, he said, "It has been reported in Paris that this misfortune turned my hair gray, but you see, it is not so," pointing to his head, "and I hope I shall be able to support many other reverses. But these prodigies, prodigious exertions, are made only, as it were, in despite of his physical powers, which never appear less susceptible than when his mind is in full activity." The emperor eats very irregularly, but generally very little. He often says that a man may hurt himself by eating too much, but never by eating too little. He will remain 24 hours without eating, only to get an appetite for the ensuing day. But if he eats little, he drinks still less. A single glass of Madeira or champagne is sufficient to restore his strength and to produce cheerfulness of spirits. He sleeps very little and very regularly, generally rising at daybreak to read or write, and afterwards lying down to sleep again. The emperor has no faith in medicine and never takes any. He had adopted a peculiar mode of treatment for himself whenever he found himself unwell. His plan was to run into an extreme, the opposite of what happened to be his habit at the time. This he calls restoring the equilibrium of nature. If, for instance, he had been inactive for a length of time, he would suddenly ride about 60 miles or hunt for a whole day. If, on the contrary, he had been harassed by great fatigues, he would resign himself to a state of absolute rest for 24 hours. These unexpected shocks infallibly brought about an internal crisis and instantly produced the desired effect. This remedy, he observed, never failed. The emperor's lymphatic system is deranged and his blood circulates with difficulty. Nature, he said, had endowed him with 2 important advantages. The one was the power of sleeping whenever he needed repose, at any hour and in any place. Another was that he was incapable of committing any injurious excess either in eating or drinking. If, said he, I go the least beyond my mark, my stomach instantly revolts. He is subject to nausea from very slight causes. A mere tickling cough is sufficient to produce that effect on him. The 26th through the 28th. On the 26th, the emperor dressed very early. He found himself quite recovered. He wished to walk out, as the weather was very fine, and besides, his room had not been put in order for 3 days. We went into the garden, and he chose to breakfast under the arbor. He was in good spirits, and his conversation turned upon many different subjects and persons. The emperor's health being now perfectly restored, he resumed his usual occupation, which indeed was his only source of amusement. Reading, dictating, and walking in the garden filled up all his time during the day. He still occasionally resorted to his favorite path, though the turn of the season and the change of the moon had nearly put a stop to our evening walks. The numerous visitors who came to Mr. Balcomb's house, attracted by the hope of meeting the emperor, annoyed him very much, and indeed compelled him to withdraw himself altogether. We therefore remained shut up in our little dwelling. We had first understood that we should remain at Briars only a few days, but 6 weeks had passed away, and we had yet heard nothing respecting our removal. All this time the emperor had been as much confined as he had been on board of the vessel. He had taken only one excursion, which was when he visited Major Hudson, and we afterwards learned that this circumstance had occasioned alarm. It had been whispered about at the admiral's ball, and had reached the ears of our high authorities, who were thrown into great consternation by the event. The workmen continued their labors at Longwood, which was to be our new residence. The troops who had come with us from England were encamped in the neighborhood. The colonel gave a ball to which we were invited. The emperor wished me to go, and that I should at the same time take the opportunity of inspecting our future abode. I went with Madame Bertrand in a carriage drawn by 6 oxen. In this Merovingian equipage we proceeded to Longwood. This was the first opportunity I had of seeing any part of the island except the neighborhood of Briars. The whole road along which we passed presented continued evidence of a great natural convulsion. We saw nothing but huge masses of rock, totally destitute of vegetation. If at every change of the horizon we perceived a trace of verdure or a few clusters of trees, yet on a nearer approach all vanished like the creations of a poet's fantasy. We found only a few marine plants and wild shrubs, or, what was still worse, some wretched gum trees. These were the only ornaments of Longwood. I returned on horseback about 6 o'clock. The emperor put many questions to me concerning our new residence. Finding that I did not speak of it very enthusiastically, he asked at once whether he should gain or lose by the change. I told what I thought in one sentence. Sire, said I, we are here in a cage. There we shall be in a fold. 28th. The emperor changed his military uniform, which he had put on to go on board the Bellerophon, for a fancy dress coat. In the course of conversation this day, the emperor adverted to the numerous conspiracies which had been formed against him. The infernal machine was mentioned in its turn. This diabolical invention, which gave rise to so many conjectures and caused the death of so many victims, was the work of the royalists, who obtained the first idea of it from the Jacobins. The emperor stated that 100 furious Jacobins, the real authors of the scenes of September the 10th of August, etc., had resolved to get rid of the first consul, for which purpose they invented a 15 or 16-pound howitz, which, on being thrown into the carriage, would explode by its own concussion and hurl destruction on every side. To make sure of their object, they proposed to lay caltrops along a part of the road, which, by suddenly impeding the horses, would, of course, render it impossible for the carriage to move on. The man who was employed to lay down the caltrops, entertaining some suspicions of the job which he was to be set upon, as well as of the morality of his employers, communicated the business to the police. The conspirators were soon traced and were apprehended near the Jardin des Plantes in the act of trying the effect of the machine, which made a terrible explosion. The first consul, whose policy it was not to divulge the numerous conspiracies of which he was the object, did not give publicity to this, but contented himself with imprisoning the criminals. He soon relaxed his orders for keeping them in close confinement, and they were allowed a certain degree of liberty in the same prison in which these Jacobins were confined. Some royalists were also imprisoned for an attempt to assassinate the first consul by means of air guns. These two parties formed a league together, and the royalists transmitted to their friends out of prison the idea of the infernal machine as being preferable to any other plan for destruction. It is very remarkable that on the evening of the catastrophe, the emperor expressed an extreme repugnance to go out. Madame Bonaparte and some intimate friends absolutely forced him to go to an oratorio. They roused him from his sofa, where he was fast asleep. One fetched him his sword, another his hat. As he drove along in the carriage, he fell asleep again, and awoke suddenly, saying that he had dreamed he was drowning in the Tagliamento. To explain what he alluded to, it is necessary to mention that some years previously, when he was general of the army of Italy, he passed the Tagliamento in his carriage during the night, contrary to the advice of everyone about him. In the ardor of youth, and heedless of every obstacle, he crossed the river surrounded by 100 men armed with poles and torches. His carriage was, however, soon set afloat. Napoleon ran the most imminent danger and for some time gave himself up for lost. At the moment when he now awoke on his way to the oratorio, he was in the midst of a conflagration. The carriage was lifted up, and the passage of the Tagliamento came fresh upon his mind. The illusion, however, was but momentary. A dreadful explosion immediately ensued. "We are blown up!" exclaimed the first consul to Len and Bessières, who were in the carriage with him. They were for stopping the carriage, but the first consul enjoined them not to do it on any account. He arrived safe and appeared at the opera as though nothing had happened. He was preserved by the desperate driving of his coachman. The machine injured only one or two individuals who closed the escort. The most trivial circumstances often lead to the most important results. The coachman was intoxicated, and there's no doubt that this proved the means of saving the life of the first consul. The man's intoxication was so great that it was not until next morning that he could be made to comprehend what had happened. He had taken the explosion for the firing of a salute. Immediately after this event, measures were adopted against the Jacobins, who had been convicted of meditating the crime, and a considerable number were banished. They, however, were not the real criminals, whose discovery was brought about by another very singular chance. 300 or 400 drivers of the fiacres subscribed a louis or 12 francs each to give a dinner to the first consul's coachman, who had become the hero of the day and the boast of his profession. During the feast, one of the guests, drinking to the health of the first consul's coachman, observed that he knew who had played him the trick, alluding to the explosion of the machine. He was immediately arrested, and it appeared that on the very night, or the night preceding the explosion, he had drawn up his fiacre beside a gate whence he had issued the little cart that had done all the mischief. The police proceeded to the place, and it was found to be a coach yard where all kinds of vehicles were let on hire. The keepers of the yard did not deny the fact. They pointed out the stall in which the cart stood, and it still presented traces of gunpowder. The proprietors declared that they were given to understand the cart had been hired by some Bretons who were concerned in smuggling. The man who had sold the horse, together with every individual who had participated in the affair, were easily traced out, and it was proved that the plot had been formed by the Chouan royalists. Some active and intelligent men were dispatched to their headquarters in Morbihan. They took no pains to conceal their share in the transaction and only regretted that it had not succeeded. Some of them were apprehended and brought to punishment. It is said that the chief conspirator afterwards turned Trappist and sought to expiate his crimes by religious austerities. The 29th through the 30th. I find in this part of my manuscript some important particulars respecting the conspiracy of George Pichegru Moreau and the trial of the Duc d'Enghien, but as these subjects recur repeatedly in the course of my journal, I transfer to another part. What occurred here, in order to bring all my information on the above points at once under the eye of the reader, Mr. Balcomb's little garden, in which we so often walked, was superintended by an old Negro. The first time we saw him, the Emperor, according to his usual custom, desired me to put some questions to him respecting his history, and his answers strongly excited our interest. He was a Malay Indian, and had been forced from his home by the crew of an English vessel and sold at St. Helena, where he had continued ever since in slavery. His story bore every mark of truth. His countenance had a frank and benevolent expression. His eyes were animated and sparkling. In short, his appearance was by no means abject, but on the contrary, truly prepossessing. The history of the poor fellow's misfortunes filled us with indignation, and a few days after, the emperor expressed a wish to purchase him and send him back to his own country. He mentioned the subject to the admiral. The latter at first defended his countrymen and declared that old Toby, which was the name of the unfortunate slave, must be an impostor, for the thing was impossible. He, however, inquired into the matter, and finding that the story was but too true, he participated in the indignation which we expressed and promised to exert his best endeavors for the fulfillment of our design. When we left Briars for Longwood, poor Toby, sharing the common fate of all earthly things, was soon forgotten. I know not what became of him. When we were in the garden, the emperor generally stopped near Toby's hut and made me question him respecting his country, the days of his youth, his family, his present situation, etc. One would have supposed that he wished to study the feelings of the old slave, by the emperor's desire, I invariably closed the conversation by giving him a Napoleon. Toby was very much attached to us. Our presence always seemed to fill him with joy. When we entered the garden, he immediately suspended his work and, resting on his spade, gazed on us with an air of satisfaction. He understood not a word of the conversation that passed between the emperor and myself, but he always seemed to anticipate with a smile the first words I translated to him. He called the emperor the good gentleman. This was the only name he ever applied to him, and he knew him by no other. I have mentioned the above particulars because our meetings with Toby were always followed by novel, spirited, and characteristic reflections on the part of the emperor. The versatility of his mind is well known. Whenever he adverted to the poor slave's misfortunes, he always took a new view of the subject. I shall content myself with noting down the following remarks. Poor Toby, said he one day, has been torn from his family, from his native land, and sold to slavery. Could anything be more miserable to himself and more criminal in others? If this crime be the act of the English captain alone, he is doubtless one of the vilest of men. But if it be that of the whole of the crew, it may have been committed by men perhaps not so base as might be imagined, for vice is always individual and scarcely ever collective. Joseph's brethren could not bring themselves to slay him, while Judas, a cool, hypocritical, calculating villain, betrayed his master. A philosopher has affirmed that men are born wicked. It would be both difficult and idle to attempt to discover whether the assertion be true. This at least is certain, that the great mass of society is not wicked. For if the majority were determined to be criminal and to violate the laws, who would have the power to restrain or prevent them? This is the triumph of civilization, for this happy result springs from its bosom and arises out of its nature. Sentiments are, for the most part, traditionary. We feel them because they were felt by those who preceded us. Thus we must look to the development of human reason and of the faculties of mankind for the only key to social order, the only secret of the legislator. It is only those who wish to deceive the people and rule them for their own personal advantage that would desire to keep them in ignorance. For the more they are enlightened, the more they will feel convinced of the utility of laws and of the necessity of defending them. And the more steady, happy, and prosperous will society become. If, however, knowledge should ever be dangerous in the multitude, it can only be when the government, in opposition to the interests of the people, drives them into an unnatural situation or dooms the lower classes to perish for want. In such a case, knowledge would inspire them with the spirit to defend themselves or to become criminal.